Hey everyone, Ariel Adams here with the aBlogtoWatch Superlative podcast. Please be sure to listen to our other podcast, aBlogtoWatch Weekly, where we cover the latest watch news and reviews. Today on Superlative, my guest is the esteemed Michael Clerizo. I have known you for I don't know how many years now. It's been a while. Michael, welcome.
Hello, Ariel. It's been since 2008. It was Basel in 2008.
Okay, so you remember precisely. That's better than me. Yep. Good. I'm glad they have you writing about these things.
Yeah, and then we went to, we arrived together at an event at Mont Blanc.
Yes.
If you remember that.
And then Mont Blanc disappeared.
And then Mont Blanc, yes, they disappeared. They've reappeared, which is a good thing. But yeah, we did.
Isn't it funny how in the time that we've been covering this industry, the industry has seemingly changed far more than the product?
Yes. Well, the industry has changed. In some ways, it's unrecognizable. If you just think about something like, we went through the whole in-house phenomenon. You have to have an in-house movement. And that was a force in the industry for years. Then it became a little bit less important to have an in-house movement. And now I'm not really sure where we are.
I'm not even sure what in-house means anymore.
No, well, I think it was aBlogtoWatch that came up with 16 different meanings for in-house. You remember that? See, yes. I remember these things, Ariel. I read aBlogtoWatch.
Thank you.
You only write it. But I remember these things. And also now we've had the rise of the micro brands. Phenomenally important.
Which is funny because that's also another term that I'm not sure that a third party would know what that means. Because most of the brands you've been talking about for years are micro brands, but no one's ever called them a micro brand.
No one ever called them micro brands. You don't mind if I sip some tea, do you?
Please, you're allowed to do that. Michael is the American living in England. How has that been an interesting part of your career as a watch writer? Because I think that to be a good writer, you sometimes need to be a little bit of fish out of water. Or are you more comfortable there than you were in the United States?
Well, I'm comfortable in both places. And we do spend a fair amount of time in the U.S. every year. I'm not really, within the watch world, I'm not a fish out of water. At least I wasn't when I was working for the Wall Street Journal. Everyone wanted to know me then. I don't perceive myself as a fish out of water. And among other watch writers here in England, I'm generally very much accepted and regarded as one of theirs.
The thing about being a watch writer is that it is of itself membership in a very kind of elite club. I guess I've always sort of felt that I wasn't really sure what waters we were swimming in. Right? Because you can't really be trained to be a watch writer. You sort of have to be introduced to it and figure it out. It is, I guess what I love about this entire thing is for years and years and years, being the watch guy was being the weirdo. And one of the changes is it's actually been normalized in society a little bit more.
Yes, I think it's been normalized and it's been in some ways respected. You know, I'm sure this happens to you every time. Oh, this is Ariel Adams from aBlogtoWatch. And people will start asking you what watch they should buy.
Oh, yeah.
And I have that happen to me as well. And the other thing that happens is people start asking me, how much do you think my grandfather's watch is worth? And generally, I have no idea.
I would start charging an appraisal fee.
Well, you know, I'll think about it, Ariel. I'll think about it. It's a good idea. Yes, I'll charge an appraisal fee.
Well, what I learned is people, it's funny because they read all these stories about these important watches, these amazing watches. And it isn't that they believe that their grandfather's watch is that great. They want to believe that their grandfather was a great person because great people end up buying great watches. And that's sort of the message they learned, right?
That's entirely right, because I was once asked this question, what's my grandfather's watch worth? And I was shown a magnificent Patek Philippe pocket watch. And I went, wow. Well, you've got quite the thing here, I said to the young lady who showed me the watch. And what was interesting to her was that her grandfather had such good taste and such foreknowledge, shall we say, that he bought a beautiful watch early in the 20th century that was now worth a considerable amount of money. And that sort of proved what a great father, what a great person her grandfather was, and how great her whole family is and how sophisticated and everything. And then she sold the watch and she got 6 figures for it, and she was overjoyed about that.
That's lovely. I wonder, back in that era, if when you went to shop for a luxury watch, there was as many options. I actually don't know. And sometimes I think like, oh, he bought this really rarefied thing, when in reality, like that was one of 4 names that they could buy, right?
Oh, sure. No, you're entirely right, because in those days, there were a lot more local brands. I mean, there was Hamilton in the U.S. There were little local watchmaking shops that could sell you a pocket watch they'd made by themselves. Yeah. With imported parts. You had, especially in the U.S., you had Waltham, you had Elgin, names like that. So the fact that this guy had bought a Patek at a time when Patek had nowhere near the enormous prestige it has now.
Yeah, you wouldn't say I wanted a Patek. You'd say something like, you know what, I want a foreign Swiss watch, and then that would be one of just a few names.
Yeah, well, and there was a story behind the watch that this woman's grandfather had traveled to Switzerland on a few occasions for whatever reason, and he bought a watch when he was there. So there was a whole family story behind it.
Yeah. So you're someone who's written now 3 books on watches. You've done a lot of journalism coverage and things like that. And you specialize in sort of a breed of person, which is the independent watchmaker. And you haven't been the only one. In fact, I think you sort of started it after you started doing some writing about them. Other people like, oh, these are interesting characters. But I think in a nutshell, explain why the independent watchmaker is a fundamentally different beast than what comes out of Omega, Tag Heuer, Rolex.
Okay. Omega, Tag Heuer, Rolex are all watch brands. They produce, and the same would be true of a brand like Longines, say. They produce a number of watches every year. They're watch brands. When you get to an independent watchmaker, if you want to qualify them and define them in brand terms, they are watchmaker brands. And by that, I mean the watchmaker is there. You can reach out and touch the watchmaker. You can talk to them. And I was very lucky early in my time writing about watches, which has been going on for just over 25 years now.
Congratulations.
One of the first people I met was George Daniels.
Lucky you.
Who is, well, to me, the first independent watchmaker.
Sadly, the late George Daniels.
Late George Daniels, yes. And, was the subject of one of my books. I wrote his biography. And when I started talking to him, I realized that he did things that were a lot like engineers do, that are a lot like artists do, that he would sit down to make a watch and he'd have a conception about it first. So there was, what was his intention for making this particular watch? And you could ask any independent watchmaker that. You could ask someone like a Vianney Halter, a Philippe Dufour, any of the great independents. There's an intention there that you can get to, you can understand. And that, I think, gives you more of an insight into how a particular watch developed. And the thing about independence that I also liked is they're not dependent on the marketing department.
They do what they want.
Yeah, they can do what they want. And if they've achieved enough prestige within the industry, so if we're talking about a brand like Greubel Forsey, for instance, the subject of my most recent book, it will sell. And they know they'll find someone who wants to own their latest modification to the traditional tourbillon. So that's what I like about those people. And they're there. You can talk to them.
Going to the most recent book, I haven't had a chance to look at all of it yet, though I actually quite like it a lot. One of the things I noticed you did is part of the book is cataloging, I think, every single Greubel Forsey watch which has been made up to a certain point. And what you do is you try to explain, I believe, what they were trying to accomplish with each one. It seems as though you were trying to determine what their aim was, because so often when you see these watches, especially from these independent brands, you know the chronology of what they produce, but you have no idea what they were trying to do from model to model. And there is a very real human iterative process where they move from model to model. They want to accomplish new things. They feel that there's certain trends or certain habits they have, which they keep going back to. And looking at from the side, you can identify these things. Am I correct? That's part of what you're trying to do?
Yes, I wouldn't use the word trends as in reference to Greubel Forsey.
Well, they have their own internal trends.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Internal trends, definitely.
Like things like the incline tourbillon. They keep trying it over and over again because they're exploring, experimenting.
Well, the really fascinating thing about the incline tourbillon, and I didn't know this until I sat down and started talking to Robert and Stephen, which I did for something like 80 hours.
Oh, wow.
I spent, it took me 2.5 years to do this book, partly because I had to do a lot of the interviewing in French and then translate it into English and then write. And I was constantly having to refer back to the French to make sure I got it right. And my French is not that great. But Robert doesn't speak English. He speaks French.
At least Stephen does.
Yes, at least Stephen does. And other people I interviewed within Greubel Forsey only spoke French. So my French improved greatly while I was writing this book. But what really happened with the inclined tourbillon is it was part of another operation Robert and Stephen had set up called Time. Now, as you know, Robert and Stephen came from Renault and Pappy.
Yes.
In fact, that was where they met. What they didn't like about Renault and Pappy is Renault and Pappy generally only accepted commissions from brands to do something. And Robert and Stephen, one of the first bits of rebellion on their part was they said, no, we're going to invent things, and then we're going to find someone who wants to buy it. And they did this for a few years under Time. And when they came to the inclined tourbillon, which they thought was a great invention, they couldn't find anyone who wanted to use it.
It's very practical, too. It's very practical.
Very. None of the brands out there that you would expect would like an inclined tourbillon wanted to buy the Time inclined tourbillon. So all the other brands said, well, no, we're not really a tourbillon brand, or they said we're working on our own evolution of the tourbillon. So the first Greubel Forsey watch, the inclined 30-degree tourbillon, was actually in some ways accidental. They never meant for it to be the start of Greubel Forsey.
But we see this many instances where there's a supplier that ends up having a brand because they can't find enough people that want to buy the stuff they do. And they're like, fine, we have to sell it ourselves.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened to them. And the story, the development of the inclined tourbillon, which I cover in the book, and which is very important in terms of how Greubel Forsey works, is that, first of all, they had it on paper, but they couldn't come up with a 3D model. They didn't know how to do it. So they couldn't experiment with it. They couldn't test it. And then one weekend, Stephen took what in America we call an erector set.
Right.
And what in Europe is called a Meccano set. And with his old Meccano set, instead of letting his son play with it for the weekend, he built a 3D model of the inclined 30-degree tourbillon. And that there's plenty of photographs of that in the book. And then he brought that to the workshop Monday morning, and suddenly They knew they had it. They could see it in front of them. And Robert said it was a very important moment for him, very exciting moment, because he could see that their idea worked in 3D physical reality. So they then started to make it themselves in proper watch proportions. But as I said, they couldn't find anyone who wanted to buy it. So they said, well, let's start Greubel Forsey. And they were very clear in the beginning because they had no idea if this would work as a commercial enterprise. So they were very clear that they were not starting a brand. They were starting out on an adventure. And they
so
didn't
romantic.
Romantic. They didn't know where it would end up. And I think one of the very important things it says about Greubel Forsey and about Robert and Stephen is that they're big risk takers. Financially.
What years are we talking about?
We're talking about the watch was launched at Basel in 2004.
Okay.
But they had started on their own in Complytime in 1999. So they were working for a few years, and they were successful as Complytime selling stuff. But when they couldn't sell the inclined tourbillon, by 2004, they had it ready to go under their own name. So
is it sort of like I know it's not exactly the same, but I'm trying to think about like an automotive analogy. And I'm thinking of something like the rotary engine, which is not a perfect analogy, but it's sort of like it's better than the standard thing, but people don't want to adopt it because it's exotic, and it also calls into question the quality of everything else.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right about it's exotic and it calls into question the quality of everything else. I think a good analogy would be the DeLorean, if you remember that.
But that had a terrible engine.
Yeah, well, it did, but it was exotic, and it looked nice, and you could
it had
clean
all that. That's true.
Yeah, you could clean it with a Brillo pad. You didn't need to get out a sponge and water and everything. So I think that's a fair comparison. The comparison Robert always made for Greubel Forsey, interestingly, is Apple.
Okay.
And he said, because we are obsessed with design, we're obsessed with innovation and invention, and we want our things to look very distinctive so that they stand out within the world of watchmaking.
Oh, there's a big difference between Apple and Greubel Forsey, though.
Yeah, there's a huge difference, certainly financially. Yes, there is. But they're admirers of Steve Jobs and what he did, again, with the emphasis on design and innovation.
So here's a question. Their first slogan is my favorite one. Maybe it's not their first one, but when I first got acquainted with them, their brand slogan was "Inventors Inventing Inventions," which I thought was incredible. I love that. But what is so interesting is this combination of sort of engineering focus with finishing, meaning just the decoration, which for many years was better than anything I'd seen at any price. And you usually don't have the sort of art department and the engineering department playing so well together. Is that because of how the dynamic of Robert and Stephen is? Or what, in your opinion, is responsible for the watches being so focused on technicity, but also the Dufour level of just absolute obsession with finishing?
I think what's going on there is one of their overarching principles, which is the finishing techniques of the 18th and 19th century have to be kept alive. But with Robert and Stephen, they felt as though they could surpass what had been done in the past. They could do finishing better than Breguet. They could do it better than someone like a John Arnold. So they wanted to keep those techniques alive, and at the same time, they wanted to surpass them.
What made them feel as though they could surpass people who had, in a lot of ways, more time than they did? Because finishing is really about time.
Finishing is very much about time. You're right. Well, a couple of things. The first thing is that for finishing, there are certain modern techniques, certain modern tools you can use. One of the most important ones is nowadays they have much more powerful loops.
Yeah.
You can see much more detail into, say, they don't use Geneva stripes too often, they have once, but they use frosting on their large plates. Now, they could examine their frosting to a much closer degree than could have been done in the 19th century.
Absolutely.
So, and that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to prove that these techniques are not fossilized, that they could be pushed even further in the modern world.
Who are they trying to prove something to? Because the consumer, again, was not demanding a product like that what they were making. They were innovative there. It took a while. It was always still is kind of a strange product to a lot of people. But who were they trying to send these messages to? Was it their peers? I'm curious. Was it Renault and Poppy? I mean, who was it?
I think, first of all, it's the entire watch industry.
Okay.
I once said to them, well, the mechanical watch is obsolete, isn't it? And it was if I had just said, I don't know, you're the two ugliest people I've ever seen in my life. They were so annoyed when I said that. And you often hear that from people, the mechanical watch is obsolete. And they say, no, it is not obsolete. We can keep time as well as just about any quartz watch can. We can do things beyond telling time. And what they wanted to do with finishing was partly, as I said, keep those techniques alive and improve them, but also they wanted to say, certainly to the Swiss watch industry, look what can be done in the 21st century. And there was a hope, again, this comes down to risk-taking. There was a belief that they would find watch lovers interested in buying their timepieces because of what they could do with them. And if you take an experienced watch collector, say someone who owns a Patek and a Vacheron, someone who might own a couple of Rolexes as well, and you put a Greubel Forsey in front of that person, they felt they could say, look how we've improved on what everyone else can do.
I mean, and I laugh a little bit because you and I know the average watch lover, there are those out there that know, but the average one, it needs to be swayed differently. That is not how they're persuaded.
No, you're entirely right. But I think, and I hope they don't mind me saying this, but at present, Greubel Forsey watches are watches for the 1%.
Oh, and they always have been. But yeah. Here's the thing. I read a lot about the history of physics and science and things like that. And I always get amused that there's scientists in emerging fields that argue and compete with one another. And they're really just competing with one another. There's like a handful of people in the world that even understand the arguments, right?
Yes.
And in a sense, they take it so seriously, and they're really this niche community. The concepts they're arguing about have really global appeal. And I see a lot of parallels in the watch space where it's like there's sort of a more mainstream consumer, not that mainstream, we're still talking luxury watches, but more mainstream, who ultimately has to buy it, has to be impressed. But in the mind of the watchmaker, he or she does not think about that consumer. He or she is thinking about a colleague sitting in the desk next to them or down the street who themselves is not going to buy the thing, but that's the person they're trying to impress with whatever they're doing.
Well, I think you're entirely correct, and that is a phenomenon we see in the watch industry.
Oh, yeah.
With Greubel Forsey, though, it was both. Yes, they wanted to impress other watchmakers, but they also, again, they're risk takers, but they just had the feeling that out there in the world, there are people who would appreciate what they were doing, and there are people who know about watchmaking techniques. They're very serious collectors. So that was the type of person they were aiming for.
Were not some of their original retailers some of the unsung heroes? Because it really takes both the product and those relationships. Because I feel like a lot, I could be wrong, but I'm guessing that some of the credit in the beginning goes to some of those distribution, sales partners around the world who were able to tell the story, right?
Well, you're entirely right about that. And there's very few retailers who could do that. But they do exist, and we all know who they are.
Yeah.
So there's never been very many doors, as to use the industry term, selling Greubel Forsey watches. They never make that many watches in a year anyway.
I mean, here in the United States, I've been close to the people that have sold Greubel Forsey, and I think what's interesting is it takes time. No one is just like sees it for the first time. It's like, yeah, I want that. It's a period of years sometimes of multiple exposure, having to see the watch, maybe various versions of it, see it on people's wrists, and just slowly recognize, oh, I get what they're trying to do. Oh, I see this is for me, especially when in some instances they cost more than $1 million a piece. But I remember, when looking at many of the watches that come out at these price points, and when I would see new ones, I never thought to myself, this is overpriced. I was like, wow, that's expensive. But they did a very good job of, if you're paying attention, throwing at you just layer on over layer of all the stuff they did. I mean, the watches are not shy. Let's put it that way.
Oh, no, I think you're very right when you say you don't look at a Greubel Forsey timepiece and think, oh, that's overpriced. Because you can see the quality and you can often see the innovation in it and the invention in it right away. And I think in a certain extent, you say it may take years to convince someone to buy one. Nobody, working on Wall Street or working in Silicon Valley or working in Hollywood or working here in London in the city, or nobody who's big in the oil business or anything like that. They don't walk into a retailer to buy their first great luxury watch and they think of buying Greubel Forsey. They think of one of the famous brands.
Yeah.
And it's only after people have had the famous brands for a while, they may go into the retailer and say, well, what else have you got? And then very few retailers around the world can say to them, well, have you considered a Greubel Forsey? And if you've had someone wearing a great watch on their wrist for 5, 6 years, 10 years, and suddenly they walk into a retailer and put in front of them is a Greubel Forsey timepiece, right away, as you say, you can tell the watch is worth the money. And it's a very impressive piece because you've got the finish and you've got that innovation and you have the design. And design can be quite striking in a lot of their timepieces. So all that comes together.
Hey y'all, Peter Cho here from Jack Mason Watches. If you don't know us by now, we are an independent watch company based out of Dallas, Texas, with a focus on building luxury-grade watches here in the United States. I started this brand with other partners back in 2015 to fulfill a desire and passion of establishing our own legacy right here in Texas. With over 20 years of traditional watch design experience in the United States and Switzerland, we guarantee that each Jack Mason watch is 100% designed in-house, and each component of the watch is unique to us. We don't use any off-the-shelf parts, which has been a strict practice since day one. Heading into a decade of business in 2025, we have plans in place to raise the bar and continue to push the boundaries in establishing heritage in Texas and making our mark in American watchmaking for many more decades to come. For more information about the brand, you can visit us at www.jackmasonbrand.com, or you can follow us on social media at Jack Mason Brand, and also find us on YouTube.
What did a personality like George Daniels feel about them? Because I think they had a lot of parallels, but I think George was, and again, you knew him better than me, more practical. I mean, he liked watchmaking more than showing off, even though he did have again, you explain it better than me, but would he have been 100% down with the Greubel Forsey vision? Would he have had some differences of opinion? How would his interests have aligned with that of Robert and Stephen?
Well, what he said about Greubel Forsey, and this is very important, George was a watchmaker, which means he's obsessed about precision.
Yeah.
When he's making things. George is also, people often forget this about him, a superb writer. And I knew from experience that he chose his words very carefully. I was once with him when he was writing a letter to Francois Paul Journe. And he thought for a very long time about what words he would use to describe Francois Paul Journe's work. And Francois Paul has the letter framed in his office now.
Oh, that's sweet.
And what George said about Greubel Forsey is they had proved that the tourbillon could be relevant in a wristwatch. That was the word he used. They proved the relevance of the tourbillon to the wristwatch. For George, this was a major accomplishment because, of course, all of his tourbillons were flat.
Yeah.
But when Greubel Forsey inclined the tourbillon and were able to prove through experimentation that it improved timing, for George, that was a major accomplishment. And George was, once again, someone who did not believe that mechanical watchmaking was obsolete. He believed it had a huge future because people have affection for mechanical watches. But that's how he described their work, as proving the tourbillon is relevant to the wristwatch. To him, that was a great accomplishment.
You know, I hearing you talk about this idea of relevancy and obsolescence reminds me that this was indeed more of a common topic, especially over the last 10 to 15 years. But more recently, I think since the pandemic and how watches have become such a huge part of pop culture, I've been hearing the obsolescence story far less. And I wonder if we've sort of gotten over that hump, because you're right, the first few generations after mechanical watches stopped being the state of the art next to electronic timepieces, you have a lot of, wait a minute, do people still need this? I wonder if now we've entered a cultural era of watches where their chronometry is still important, but ultimately less relevant in the scheme of, are they still state of the art? I just want to know if you think that we've sort of gotten over that hurdle a little bit.
Well, I think we have. I think in my case, the evidence is anecdotal. And where it comes from is just being out in the world, not being with people in the watch industry. But someone says to you, what do you do for a living? Well, I write about watches. Really? Wow, that's so exciting. And having had that reaction so many times, I think the most extreme case of that was in 2011, I had a stroke. And while I was in the ambulance being taken to the hospital, I could talk a little bit. I couldn't talk much. Somebody said to me, what do you do? And I said, I write about watches. And that was about the only sentence I could get out. And the ambulance driver nearly stopped the ambulance because this guy turns out to be a total watch nut.
And you're like, please take me to the hospital.
Yeah, please get me to the hospital. And when I was in the hospital recovering, he came to see me because he wanted to talk about watches. And I lost my ability to speak for a while, but he kept in touch until he could have a conversation with me about watches. Wow. And this guy, he was buying very inexpensive mechanical watches, but he was buying mechanical watches. And he said, I'd never wear quartz, I just can't do that. There's nothing to love about a quartz watch. And I've run into that attitude quite a lot in recent years. So yes, I think watches have entered the cultural conversation we're having a lot of times these days.
That's one of the things that continues to impress me about this, and I discuss this with pretty much everyone I can, especially persons such as yourself, where this is to the heart of what you do. But I'm continually impressed by the durability and resilience of the watch hobby. Clearly, this industry has been around for hundreds of years now, and there have been dark periods and bright periods all the same. But there's this sort of almost immortality about it where
Yes.
it will not go away. That's great for us. But a decade ago, you could not have had me predict how much more popular watches are today than back then. I wouldn't have believed you.
Well, you wouldn't have believed me because I would have said it. I would
Anyone for that matter.
I would have said I don't think mechanical watchmaking will ever die, simply because
It's more popular, Michael.
Yeah, I know it is much more popular than it was 10 years ago. And I know we say things that sound like cliches to us in the watch industry, but it's like it's a living thing. It goes tick, 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 and it has a heart. And a human being made it. Even if we're talking about a mass market brand, still there are humans involved in it. And I also think that there's an element of craft in every mechanical watch. And human beings, we survived as a species, partly because we learned how to manipulate tools. So I wonder if, I can't prove this, we're hardwired by evolution to appreciate craft, appreciate things you do with tools. And that's one reason why the mechanical watch maintains its popularity.
I would add to that, and I agree that we are hardwired to be tool users and tool appreciators, but the watch is a human invention, not just the watch itself, but the way we track time. It's not a physical phenomenon like gravity that we're measuring. It's sort of an arbitrary thing that we came up with ourselves to do a very human thing, is so we can agree on time. Because naturally, we're terrible at telling time. We always talk about time seems slow or time seems faster. The watch allows people like you and me to agree, yeah, that was 5 minutes. No difference of opinion. That interval, that was 5 minutes. We can agree on that, right? So
exactly.
So I think watches are, in a very real sense, an extension of us as an organism. It's a piece of us. And that's why we're so drawn to it.
Yeah, I think you're entirely right. Philippe Dufour, another great independent watchmaker, I asked him, why are none of your watches automatic? And he said, I don't like automatics because if you have a hand-wound watch, the watch and the wearer become a team. You have to put something into the watch to get it to keep going. And that makes you and the watch a team. And he really liked that idea. And of course, no Greubel Forsey watch is automatic. They're all hand wound. So
at least they have a power reserve. They put that part in there.
Oh, they have a very impressive power reserve.
Okay, I have a question. On not all of them, but on the rear of many Greubel Forsey watches that I saw was this intricate engraved message, always in French. And they never wanted me to take pictures of it. Like, this is a secret message. What was that message all about? What was that? That was such an interesting, unique, weird thing. I never quite understood it.
Well, there's quite a lot in those messages. And what it is they're trying to explain a lot of the things we were just talking about. They're talking about, for example, technology. So technique is in there. You'd see that word. You'd see the word quality. In some, you might see the word adventure. On some, you might see the word architecture. So there are all of these words in there that have meaning to the people at Greubel Forsey, and they hope will come to have meaning to the person wearing the timepiece. There are a few instances where they're very, very specific, where they say, we are watchmakers, and we have created this timepiece, and this timepiece encompasses architecture, quality, technology, and all these different things. Yeah, there are some of the pieces they don't want what's on the back revealed. It's purely between them and the wearer.
I was just amused by it. I thought it was kind of cute. I'd never heard of such a thing. This level of messaging, I see them both as artists because they express themselves in the work. What is some of the relationships they have with the buyers? Do they have friends who are fans? Do they keep a distance? I'm just wondering with the relationship, because they want to express so much. Are they actually going so far as to have deep relations with the consumers, or they have to maintain a distance, which can be normal?
I think it's both, really. With some of their collectors, as they would call them, yes, they are very familiar with them and know a lot about the person and know what the person might consider purchasing. Generally, though, their watches are sold through a few retailers. And sometimes those retailers will share the end user, and sometimes they won't.
Right.
One of the things that I think is very common, though, for Greubel Forsey is anyone who buys a watch at auction, they tend to, the first thing they do is bring it back to Greubel Forsey for a servicing. And those people will come to visit the atelier in Switzerland. Yes, their timepiece will be examined, serviced if it needs to be, and they can often get a tour of the complete Greubel Forsey operation and see what else is coming down the pike. So it's both. They have good relationships, close relationships with some of their collectors. Others purchase from a retailer and know they don't know much about them.
Over the last couple of years, I've noticed that there's been some, we'll call them, changes at Greubel Forsey on a business level. A CEO came in and they talked about increasing production and diversifying some of the price points, which means lower, yet still, six-figure price points. And I want to know if that is compatible with the core mission that Stephen and Robert set out, if it's something that can be scaled, or just by necessity, it has to evolve. Things can't stay in this, early idealized state. If a business is going to continue, then adjustments need to be made.
Well, I think it's the latter. Things have to evolve. Exactly how they will evolve, I don't know. I didn't write so much about the business part of Greubel Forsey. I wrote about the timepieces.
Yeah.
But I would say a part of what's going on at Greubel Forsey is an organization. For example, they now have collections, something 5 years ago they didn't have.
Right.
Another very important point is, if you go back to their mechanical computer watch with the
perpetual calendar?
Yeah, and the equation of time and perpetual calendar. Go back to that. Now, the mechanical computer, like a lot of their inventions, has only been used once. So I think what we may see in the future, I'm not definitely predicting this, is the mechanical computer showing up in more timepieces. There's definitely going to be an attempt, I think there will be an attempt to do that, to increase the use of various inventions, and particularly, because their most recent release, the nanotechnology. We're going to see that in a lot more of their timepieces in the future. That's certainly what they want to do. But everything there takes a long time because they are rigorous experimenters. They experiment about everything. Nothing comes out of the Greubel Forsey atelier in, say, a year. Everything takes much longer because they experiment. They have to have proof, definitive proof that what they want to do will work when the timepiece goes on the wrist. So
I think some context is merited there, because if you haven't developed a new machine, you might not recognize that most new machines end up not working in one way or another, need to have kinks worked out, and that's not something you can determine through modeling software. you have to build a prototype, let it run, and see what happens. That's really all you can do. And that's the type of experimentation. And that takes time and effort and money. And then you might have to redesign it. But that's what separates, I guess you could say, a reliable from a non-reliable watch movement.
Well, you're exactly right. And they experiment and test, experiment and test, experiment and test. It goes on for a very long time. Some of their timepieces have taken 7 years to develop. Nanotechnology has been in the works for 15 years.
So watches in general are a form of nanotechnology. I mean, people who study them from an engineering perspective, they call it, microengineering. It's a specialty in certain parts of the world, especially Switzerland. But I think when Greubel Forsey says nano, they fundamentally mean something different or smaller. And maybe you can explain at least the concept of nano. What does that mean to them, and how is it different than all the other small things in watches?
Well, first of all, their idea of nano was inspired by nanotechnology as it applies to medicine. And the fact that there would be these tiny robots that might be injected into our bodies and would do things like attack tumors or repair hernias or whatever. That really intrigued them, because these tiny robots were often mechanical. Not always, but often. And it's a very simple idea, which is that if you can make the components of a timepiece smaller, not only do you save space,
but you can swallow it.
You can,
but you can swallow it.
Yeah, if you wanted to, you can swallow it. But also, you increase the amount of energy you have free to do something other than tell the time. So their idea was very much, well, wait a minute. If we can make the technology, we can make the components even smaller, we increase the space, but we also have a lot more power. So we can put into less space more complications.
So what has been the prime manifestation of this? Because I know that they had, I guess twice they've done it with the small little Fujiryanta hand. There's the recent watch, and then there's the one from a few years ago. But the resulting watch actually seemed to have quite low power reserve overall, if you looked at the small details. So I'm wondering, where have those power savings really been seen?
Well, they haven't been seen yet.
Oh.
Because it's something that will happen in the future.
Okay.
Fujiryanta uses quite a lot of energy.
Sure.
So right now, there is a watch with Fujiryanta, with a chronograph, with other features, which is a lot to have in a timepiece with a Fujiryanta. Yes, it uses more energy than you might think, but they know, again, because they're experimenting with this constantly, and I met the people working on it, and I interviewed them for the book. They know they have a lot more energy to play with.
Okay.
They have a lot more energy to do things with, and they're hoping, and this hope will be realized because they're all fanatics there about succeeding at things. They will in the future be able to produce timepieces that have more components in them because they use less energy just to do the basics. I don't think, and I don't know this for certain, but other nanotechnology timepieces may not have a Fujiryanta in them because they've done that. So now they want to do something different. They want to prove
Here's
they
a question,
can push
Michael.
it.
Here's a question, again, going to their love of the medical device industry. And this is really a philosophical question, though I think we'd actually get to this point soon. In the medical industry, we now have the ability for robots to do things that human surgeons couldn't do because of manual dexterity and things like that. So you can have robot assisted, or the robot can do the entire thing. Is it still traditional watchmaking if you need a robot to assemble a watch movement where the parts are so small and so precise and so easy to mess up that a human hand just can't do it, is that heresy? Or is that in some ways, if you wanted to go to this nano route, the logical extension? Because I can see vastly complicated movements using tiny, tiny parts, but the human limitation on dexterity limits our ability to assemble that. Is that a divisive kind of topic?
I think it will be a topic for discussion in the watch industry in the years to come. Now, bear in mind, we've had a watch, the System 51 from Swatch, which was entirely assembled by robots.
But it's hardly complicated.
Yes, it's highly complicated. Hardly complicated. Hardly, yes. And you wouldn't compare it to a Greubel Forsey timepiece.
You can't fix it.
And you can't fix it, no. And I have one and it can't be fixed. I'm really annoyed about that. It's going to be both. So, for example, for some of the nanotechnology timepiece they've already developed and have already made available, they had to not so much change the technique as they had to invent new tools so that human beings could still be involved in the assembly and the finishing of the timepiece. Yes, the component might have to be made by an outside supplier who has more sophisticated machinery than Greubel Forsey does. But the assembly and the finishing is still done by human beings. So they had to invent new tools. Obviously, you have to use a very powerful microscope to be able to see what you're doing. But that's not so much a leap for a watchmaker. You know, if you're used to wearing a loop and suddenly you have to wear a much more powerful one,
I want to talk about the art watches they did with the little sculptures in there. And this sort of is part of the nano thing. These were not functional components, but for those who are not familiar, there was a series of watches and the crown also had a little window in it. And you would look into this window and there was like a little tiny model. Yeah. One of them had the Fujirante thing, actually, that was not a model, but most of them had a little model. And there was this gentleman, I met him, Wiggin was his name?
Yes, Willard Wiggin.
Willard Wiggin, who was was a micro artist. He would, you basically use sniper breathing techniques to do these tiny little paintings and stuff. And Greubel Forsey was just mesmerized by these and put a few of them inside there. What was that all about? Was this them exploring there's other nano nerds out there, not just us? We want to show that we're not the only ones. What was that all about?
Well, I think it is that there's other nano nerds out there. It's simply that, as Robert said to me, while they worked in very different ways, Greubel Forsey and Willard Wiggin, their language that they both spoke was the language of very small things. So if you like, they didn't need translation so much because they could understand what Willard had done because they worked with very small things. And, sometimes assembling some parts of any watch, you need not to breathe for a few seconds. You have those sniper techniques of breathing.
Yeah.
And they were simply fascinated that Willard was able to, on such a tiny, tiny scale, create something that was recognizable, like a ship, for example, or like a top hat with cards going in and out of it. And that just fascinated them. It was the same language they use, but in a different way. And the great challenge for those pieces was that second crown, which actually has a microscope in it. And when they first proposed this idea, and they spoke to people who make lenses for cameras and people who make microscopes, and they said, we want to put a microscope into a watch, everyone told them that's impossible. And Robert has this great expression, which is, everything is impossible until we do it.
I mean, Rolex did that with a magnifier. How hard could it be?
I think it was a little bit different with Rolex because with the magnifier, the numerals beneath the magnifier are bigger than Willard Wiggins' sculptures. So they had to call in an optical physicist, and they worked on making, and they told the guy, look, forget about everything you know, because what you know is going to stop you doing what we want to have done.
So who says it? Who gives these motivational speeches?
That would have been Stephen mostly.
Okay.
Although it's sometimes difficult to tell where Robert stops and Stephen begins and vice versa. And they just told this guy, forget about what you know. This is what we want you to do. And they did it eventually. They worked it out.
Yeah, but
how to get a microscope. There's no shortage
of stories of people in Switzerland calmly saying without much thought, I can't do that. This is a common thing.
You're entirely right. There is. I mean, I know from George Daniels' experience with coaxial escapement, almost everyone in Switzerland said, you can't do this. This is impossible.
It's like they don't want him to do it. When they say that, they're saying, I haven't heard about it before, and I don't want to think about something new. That's all I hear.
Yeah, that's true. George wouldn't disagree with that assessment. But I think there's a very important point to be made here about Greubel Forsey. You often hear, oh, look, Robert comes up with these brilliant ideas. He's just a genius. And then Stephen turns them into reality. And when I was speaking with other members of the Greubel Forsey team, I said this. And they said, oh, no, you've got it completely wrong. I said, oh, but this is accepted knowledge. A lot of people in the watch industry will say this. Robert comes up with his ideas, Stephen turns it into reality. And they said, well, you say that because you're an English speaker, which was a bit of a shock to me. Sorry, I speak English, so, somehow or another I'm narrow-minded. And they said, the truth of the matter is that in the English-speaking world, you have this idea of genius that it's just conceptions, it's just ideas. In the French-speaking world, we have this concept that there's such a thing as the genius of the hand.
So the genius is the person that puts the ideas into execution.
They're both geniuses.
Okay, so yeah.
But by the way, Robert is a brilliant watchmaker. I never undersell Robert as a watchmaker. And as far as Stephen saying, oh, well, I'm just a watchmaker, that's nothing but British understatement.
Yeah. He likes being very humble, a tongue-in-cheek kind of way.
Yes. Oh, exactly. So the people within Greubel Forsey said to me, you got it all wrong. We, the team, can sit around for weeks trying to figure something out, how to make something. Stephen walks into the room, says, okay, what's the problem? They explained it to him. And they said, 5 minutes later, you've got the solution. So don't think just because someone uses their hands, they're not a genius. They said to me, wouldn't you consider Michelangelo, a great sculptor, a genius? And I said, yeah. Well, there you go. You have to see the word genius both ways.
On that note, one more question that we have time for, and this is something you might need to think about for a moment. You've tracked the careers of multiple independent watch companies, and some of them have solo creative minds at the top, and some of them are pairs. What are some of the differences between when a brand has one autocratic leader versus one where there's a pair? Greubel Forsey, Urwerk, great examples of where there's a pair. And then there's plenty of examples of where there's a solo person. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but they're clearly different. And since you've cataloged and surveyed in detail both of them, try to give some observations about how they're distinct.
Well, Urwerk and Greubel Forsey are two that leap immediately to mind when you consider pairs. And someone like Vianney Halter is a single engine force, if you like.
Yeah.
He'd appreciate that because he flies a single engine airplane. I think, well, with Vianney, one of Vianney's traits is he actually looks at things from quite a lot of angles. And I think the key to the success of the individual independent, Roger Smith is another example of this, and George was, is they see things in the round. They look at things from a number of different angles. They're not a uni-angle mind.
And you're saying most people are more one-dimensional?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, so I would say that about myself. I think I'm very one-dimensional. I'm about words. And I think, so you get that with someone like Vianney, Roger Smith. You had it with George. And there's no way to explain why from those one individual operations, we still get magnificent watches. And when we have pairs, we also get magnificent watches. I think it depends on how they mesh together when there's a pair. And that meshing together is very important.
Because those individuals who are part of that pair, I guess I should have said this, I don't think they would do it alone. I think that pair bonding, that duo, creates a synergy that wouldn't exist if it was just the two individual people.
I think that's often the case. There's bound to be exceptions to the rule, but you're right, that's often the case. I think Robert and Stephen, if they had never met, would still be making superb timepieces one way or the other.
But the combination, maybe, I mean, look, there's the thing is this, if you haven't seen a Greubel Forsey, you should. Because the reality is when you compare it with the many other watches of high effort, it is even an exemplar, a superlatively high effort watch. And you again, plenty of people in the space say, you know what? I'm going to show them what high effort is. I'm going to do effort. They'll see what effort means. And it's not that they fail. They put effort into it, but then you look at it and you're like, well, effort maybe, perfection, not so much.
Yeah.
And so I feel that sometimes, not all the time, when these two individuals sort of bounce on one another, you get something that one person could have done but wouldn't because it's not as well-rounded. And I think maybe that sort of combination of technicity and aesthetic I mentioned earlier, while it's difficult to attribute to one or the other, that's part of it. The last thing I'm curious about is at the company or maybe in the industry, do they have like acolytes? Do they have followers? Because it was very interesting when you said earlier that at Renault and Poppy, there was this idea of like, no, we're just fulfilling clients' orders. We're not inventing things. There is a lot of rebelliousness in watchmakers. There is a lot of desire to invent, to play, to experiment. Does someone like Stephen and Robert, and again, I know they had the foundation and stuff like that, so I think there's an opening there, but talk about how they've inspired others.
Well, I think the way in which they've inspired others is mostly contained within Greubel Forsey, because you speak to people there and you hear them say, well, yeah, I could work anywhere in the industry, but I would never work anywhere but here because of the freedom we're granted.
Freedom.
And also because Robert and Stephen really let people go to an extent, and they let them develop their own ideas. If you look at the number of patents Greubel Forsey has, you don't see just Robert Greubel and Stephen Forsey on the patent. You'll often see other people who work at Greubel Forsey. So there's a freedom, there's a willingness, very important. There's a willingness to let people fail if they have a really good idea. And in that way, I think Robert and Stephen have been very inspirational to people within their organization. And people don't often leave Greubel Forsey. There's a number of people who've been there for a long time, even though they might make more money somewhere else, like, let's say, at Cartier or Vacheron or Patek.
Because it's a better lifestyle there. Well, the book is Greubel Forsey, The Art of Invention, written by Michael Clerizo. Michael, before we end, let people know where they can get the book and where they can learn more about you on the internet.
Okay, right now, the book is available from Thames and Hudson, the publisher. and whose offices I'm in right now. And it's also available for pre-order there, but also obviously it's available for pre-order from Amazon. So you can get it because Thames and Hudson has offices in the U.S. And another important thing to point out is the book will be available in French, Spanish, Japanese, and Chinese.
And I recommend that people check out Michael's other books as well. Michael, we'll have to have you back on the show because obviously there's so much more we could talk about. But thank you so much for being my guest on this episode of Superlative.
Ariel, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. It's something I always look forward to.